Hi everyone, and welcome to the Newsagent podcast. I'm Susie Lysett, Goodlord Senior Content Executive, and this episode is a recording of part 2 of our Renters Reform Bill webinar series. David Smith, partner at JMW Solicitors, joined this session to share his expertise on the abolition of Section 21, as well as the strengthened grounds for Section 8 and what this all means for the lettings sector. Now, this webinar series is CPD accredited, so if you want to build up your CPD credits, I'll add the link in the show notes so you can head there to watch the on-demand recording. But for those of you that prefer to get your legislation updates on the go, let's crack on with the podcast.
Morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Renters Reform Bill series. It's a pleasure to be joined today by David Smith. David's going to join us shortly. Today, we're going to be discussing the end of Section 21. Quite a well-voiced issue coming down the tracks as per the Renters Reform Bill, and something that I'm sure as agents you've been thinking a lot about. And hopefully today we can guide you through the proposed changes and talk a bit more about the effect of those changes and understand exactly what is potentially happening in this area of the sector. For those who are joining today who don't know who Goodlord are, we are a pre-tenancy platform that expedite the entire pre-tenancy process, allowing you to be more efficient and focus on things like business generation and revenue generation. If you're not aware or haven't seen what our platform can do for you, then please do jump on our website and indeed you can book a demo and see exactly how our platform can help your business. Today really isn't about Goodlord, as most of our webinars actually aren't. Today is about understanding exactly what the end of Section 21 spells for the industry, for you as letting agents, for your landlords, and indeed for your tenants. So again, I'm pleased to be joined by Mr. David Smith. Good morning, David.
Morning.
Good morning. I'm not sure, are you able to put your camera on?
I think someone has to turn me on. I've been stopped.
Oh no, Sarah, can we help?
I'm fortified by tea, but I need someone. Oh, there we go. There's my video. Right.
There we go.
I'm fully fortified with my cup of tea, ready to answer as many questions as possible about all of this.
Again, thank you for joining us this morning. For those who don't know who David Smith is, would you like to just let us know a bit more about yourself and how you act within the industry?
This is always my least favourite part of any webinar. Wow, I'm a partner in a law firm in London called JMW. It's actually a Manchester law firm, but I work in the London office. I have always specialised in residential landlord and tenant law, about which I've written and spoken a fair bit and written the odd book here and there, which some of you may have been unlucky enough to read or see before. Apparently, I know stuff. Other people might just say I'm a flagrant self-publicist. You take the pick.
and not light on opinion, I think is fair to say, David.
I have been noted for being blunt about what I think about stuff. Yes, I'm not always the government's favourite person.
Well, indeed, I think it's fair to say the industry is grateful for people that hold well-backed opinion, especially in a time of such change. And I know that you do a lot behind the scenes as well to sort of lobby and really understand and challenge change where sometimes it doesn't make the most sense. And that's indeed what today is about. We're going to unpick, I suppose, the elements of the change that do make sense and try and give some perspective on that, but also maybe expose through David's insights some of the stuff that maybe doesn't make as much sense. And when it comes to the end of Section 21, this is an issue that has got a lot of airtime, and I think we've noted on these series of webinars before, maybe unjustly, with any kind of change, with any kind of movement, there's often a lot of media attention, and with that comes a bit of scaremongering. So we're going to hopefully unpick the bits we should be concerned about, we should focus on today, against the bits that actually, it's not real change here. So in terms of an agenda, we're going to go through a couple of things today. We're going to discuss, indeed, the end of Section 21, remind ourselves where we started to where we're going, and talk about the effect of those changes on you as letting agents and landlords. We're going to talk about the changes to Section 8 as well, and what Section 8 is going to be utilised for moving forwards in a way that maybe it isn't at the moment, albeit it could be. And like I said, the Q&A is on throughout. So any questions you have for either David or I, anything to do with the changes, the industry, Goodlord, whatever it may be, we're here to answer those questions. So let's get into it, David. As I say, this is a subject that frankly has got, I think, the most airtime out of any of the reform changes, and something that agents and landlords have vocalised quite loudly that they're extremely worried about. But I think it's important to remind ourselves of what the original purpose of Section 21 was. So could you sort of take us through that, maybe? Take us back in time.
Yeah, I mean, I think I should be open right now and say I've always been of the view that I don't think Section 21 is the all and end all of life. And it's quite a unique thing in many ways to the England and Wales PRS and Scottish PRS until more recently, and it's not something you find elsewhere. But essentially, the original purpose of Section 21 was so that assured shorthold tenancies could be for fixed terms, and at the end of those fixed terms, landlords would be able to recover possession using Section 21 at the end of the agreed period. I mean, I think we should recognise that the Housing Act 88 was never intended to be the way it was. The government intended that the vast majority of tenants would be on fully assured tenancies that were periodic all the time, but were lifetime tenancies, and that would probably be held by institutional investors. The AST was considered to be a sort of small-scale secondary thing that the vast majority of people would not be in. And then for one reason or other, and there are disputed reasons for all of this, but things got away from them. And the reality is that is not what happened. And the sector looks totally different from the government's original plan, with a very large number of small investors. I mean, we should all recognise, I think, that essentially in 1988, letting agents just didn't exist. And there certainly were nowhere near as many as there are. If we try, assume the technology existed and we had this webinar in 1988, there'd be like 5 people on it. And that would be like half the sector, you know. So the idea that all of this would be the way it is was simply not planned. Now, the difficulty, of course, is that Section 21, especially in a normally functioning market where you've got reasonable levels of supply meeting demand, it probably wouldn't matter that much. But the reality is as we're all aware, for, again, a wide range of disputed reasons, which I don't think we need to trouble ourselves with right now, supply and demand are not matching terribly well in the sector. There's a lot more demand than there is available supply, particularly, of course, in the southeast, because obviously it gets a bit more subtle about supply and demand in different parts of the sector. And that's led to, I think, what we could reasonably describe as a certain amount of misuse of Section 21. So Section 21, of course, has ended up being used to some extent as a negotiation with guns to people's heads. So, for example, higher rent on a renewal, or I'll serve you Section 21 and get someone else. It's been misused by some landlords to remove people who've complained about repairs. And then I think we should be honest, and I do that. I have to be very clear, this happens in lots of my cases as well. You get the sort of grey area Section 21 where the tenant's in rent arrears, they're quite severe. Tenants also complaining about disrepair. You don't think much of it, and our legal view is, well, it probably isn't really disrepair actually. But rather than go through the Section 8 process and have that discussion, we simply say, we'll serve a Section 21 and evict just on the Section 21, and that discussion goes away. And while that is lawful, it isn't really what Section 21 was intended for. And I sort of call that grey area Section 21, in which you have a justification for evicting somebody, but where your justification might be considered by the courts if you'd use the Section 8 process, if you use the Section 21 process, it's not considered, and therefore there's no opportunity for the tenant to respond to some of it. The width of the thing has exploded beyond the real intention that existed initially.
And that width, that grey area is something we see within our business from a rent protection perspective. But does it not suggest that the other mechanisms available actually aren't as robust in practice as they could be, and therefore Section 21 is the covers all process that essentially has been allowed to be misused in your terms moving forward?
Sure. So there are other structural reasons. For example, a lot of people use Section 21 simply because they can use accelerated possession proceedings. And they do that largely because they can do it themselves and cut out stinky, expensive solicitors like myself. And it cuts us out the loop, which is perfectly fair enough. Why should we get a monopoly on work by the legal system? I mean, so I can understand why people do that, but at the same time, judges are not always as robust as they could be on discretionary grounds for Section 8. I think particularly, most notably, antisocial behaviour is a problem. And if you have to prove stuff, there's always a risk that you won't be able to prove stuff. And so you get this position where people might try and go to court for antisocial behaviour, and it takes ages because you have multiple hearings because the judge isn't convinced. And so in some cases, I think judges have lacked robustness about very real problems that landlords are having. And that's been allowed to propagate, and then the senior, and then not enough stuff. This stuff is appealed. There's no real incentive to appeal, because what tends to happen, of course, is where you might have appealed and got senior court to deal with it, you're like, oh, sod it, let's just serve a Section 21 and we'll just resolve it that way. Let's not go there. So there's a sort of, both sides feed off each other in a sense to not resolve the legal questions. So that's a problem as well. And then, of course, the court system is just achingly slow and frankly not improving due to, again, systemic underfunding over an extended period. And I could go on for ages about the inappropriateness of not funding your justice system in a functioning democracy. I probably shouldn't.
Well, we've got that as a bullet point for the last slide, just in case it does go on for ages, so we can credit sure. But I think it's worth noting, I think it's an important point, that when you're making change and you're layering change on top of what is a arguably broken process and system that is underinvested, the question is whether that change is actually going to be effective in a way that, in theory, they're setting out to do, which again we're going to cover shortly. But you talk there in terms of where Section 21 has come from, where the market was to where the market is now. Renting property has become more of a staple diet of being a citizen of this country, and I think arguably it's not going away. It's harder probably to buy a house, especially given the cost of living crisis now, than it is going to be to rent a property, albeit supply and demand issues make that even tougher. And there's different pressures there. The point in terms of around how Section 21 is utilised now, we talk about that grey area, talk about misuse. There has been. Do you think that Section 21 has been unfairly labelled? Because if you read anything in the mainstream media, I'm not trying to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, but it's often labelled as a no-fault eviction, and I struggle to accept that is a well-placed common phrase, because I'm not convinced landlords do wake up on a Saturday morning, have their breakfast, and think, "What should we do today? I think we'll have a game of tennis, we'll go for some bridge, and then we'll evict our tenants." That's not really quite how it works. But that speaks to your point earlier about the broadness of Section 21 being a catch-all, really, I suppose. And do you think it's then therefore been unfairly labelled and targeted as part of this reform? I mean,
part of the problem here undoubtedly is that the media has ended up painting landlords as all basically scumbags. And tenant groups, obviously, I mean, and you can blame them, but at the end of the day, they've got a group of people to represent. That's their job. And they're hardly going to sit there, if they want reform of the system, saying, God, most landlords are great, are they? They're going to sit there and highlight the bad cases. And the difficulty, and I say this having obviously worked in public affairs for landlords quite a long time, is you don't get people writing stories in the press saying, "Oh yes, I had a great time with my landlord," because it's just a rather dull story, frankly. It's a far better story to write in the press to say, my landlord set fire to my teddy bear while there was water pouring through my ceiling. It's always going to be a better story, and so the media tends to over-egg stories. And then I think part of the problem here as well, of course, is that politics is done by social media now. The reality is that the vast majority of MPs and politicians get far too much of their news from social media, have a pretty unsophisticated understanding of the laws that they deal with, and tend to jump to knee-jerk reaction. And the nature of social media and politics, again, is not something I should. There's plenty of other people talking about it. I'm not going to harp on about it, but it does tend to relatively crowd-pleasing, knee-jerk stuff that you can tweet. I mean, the ideal government policy these days is 140 characters, and that you can get out there on Twitter. So it's difficult to have more nuanced conversations at the moment, and that certainly doesn't help matters. And the problem is, of course, that some landlords undoubtedly do abuse Section 21, which leads you to the conclusion that all landlords abuse Section 21. And there is a tendency in Parliament at the moment to legislate for the margins. So in general terms, it's not good law to write law for very exceptional boundary cases. You tend to write law for the majority of stuff. And then obviously you deal with serious exceptions like killing people. You obviously write law to say, no, you can't do that, even though a lot of people do it. But in general terms, in regulatory law, it's not generally a good idea to write law that only deals with very small numbers of boundary cases. You want to keep the majority of people on the straight and narrow, and then probably use effective active enforcement against a small minority. But we've tended towards the situation of trying to write cases of minority, and you can see that with Section 21. I mean, we've lumped more and more and more obligations on your use of Section 1, which lead it to becoming traps for the unwary. Whether or not you have to serve your gas safety certificates and your EPCs and all of these additional documents. And that's ended up, of course, in a number of cases which I've been involved in complex nonsense before the appellate courts of like Trecarron and Rounsfield, where a gas safety certificate existed but hadn't been given to the tenant. Northwood Solihull, where you've got the tenancy deposit information has been signed, but not in quite the right way, and the wrong box was ticked on a Section 8 notice. So you tend to get these, it leads to a situation where you get fairly purposeless appeals running up to the top tier of the courts about really minor stuff because the system has become too focused on trivial detail. I mean, is it really that important for the service of a Section 21 whether you signed the tenancy deposit protection certificate if the tenant's deposit was protected and they had the necessary information? Do you really need to sign to confirm that it was true? Is that important? But apparently, it is important, but only because the law says it is.
And we've got a few questions coming in around some of the complexities. And actually, somebody who's not left their name, but good morning to you. They say the Section 21 Form 6A is very simple and easy to complete. Section 8 is more complicated, with the need to give a full explanation of why each ground is being relied on. Do you expect, David, this to be simplified to allow landlords and agents to serve notice without the need to instruct a solicitor?
I think landlords couldn't serve a Section 8. I mean, the law is already much simpler than people think. I mean, I know the law says you have to give a full explanation why the ground has been relied on, but the case law is pretty clear that explanation can be pretty actually quite lowbrow. For example, in ground 8, it's perfectly acceptable to say the rent arrears exceed X, which is more than 2 months' rent. That's an acceptable form of words. So the only time you have to give a detailed explanation really is in relation to ground 14. When you're required really to itemize all of the ground's possession. But I mean, the reality is I don't see any particular problem with people serving Section 8 notices, but I think the real problem here is that the market needs to move on. Because Section 21 is so heavily used, it's not led to much innovation. I think there's much more scope available. I'm working with a number of people on more technological solutions that would allow agents to access tools to serve more effective Section 8 notices. And that so far there's been a low level of market pressure. But I mean, the other problem is that because of the casual attitude towards Section 21, people think it's like a really trivial job, and so the market's driven down the price to silly levels. And the same thing can be said about conveyancing. These are actually quite complex issues involving transfers of property. If you want to serve a break notice on a commercial property, you can bet your bottom dollar you'll be paying a great deal of money while someone makes sure it's absolutely right. We've trivialized the notice service process. Now, in part, we've trivialized it because structurally, a lot of tenants don't leave because the council tells them not to, and so people see it as the necessary gateway to do what they actually need to do, which is go to court. So we need to try and. I mean, ideally there should be some structural alteration. That's not legislative stuff, really. It's about guidance to councils being different. It's about different approaches to the service of notices and what that means. And to be fair, the Fairer Renting White Paper talks about that, but then so numerous other white papers and numerous other government documents. We'll have to see if that has an effect on the ground. But notices probably should be more serious and less trivial than they currently are.
And on the point, I'm going to try and get through some of the questions. Got a few sort of flowy come in before we go on to the next point, David. So I'm going to try and tenuously try these into the point you're making. If it doesn't make sense, then bear with me. But on the point of serving sections, we have somebody else who has not left their name, but good morning. In order to serve a section 21 and 8, currently, if the property has an up-to-date gas safety certificate, but these haven't been sent to the tenant each year, apart from the start of the tenancy, can a notice be served, they ask?
On a section 21, if the tenant got the original one and you've got them, but you haven't sent them, if you send them the most recent one, you could serve a section 21 notice, yes. Section 8 notice, it's not a problem. I mean, I think I should probably say, let's start talking a little bit about the fair renting white paper. One of the things the government is saying is that under the reforms they're proposing, they will do away with these vast majority of these technical requirements, and the only thing they're retaining is having dealt with the deposit, and then not necessarily for every ground for possession either. So that the general tenor of the government is to try and remove some of these odd little restrictions, and obviously massively cut the amount of money I earn by stopping me going to the Court of Appeal about these trivial appeals all the time.
Yeah. And moving on, Matthew says, hi, comma. I fear, Matthew, there may have been more to your question than hi, but we both say hi back. Good morning, Matthew. If you do want to post a question, please do have another go. And moving on to actually what the reform is going to do, and using this as a conduit to discuss that. Demi asks, we have many landlords who serve Section 21 due to the tenant being unpleasant. But there's not enough there to evict with antisocial behaviour. Do you think the new laws will restrict this? Well, we'll come on to antisocial behaviour shortly, but let's talk about what the proposed changes are, because part of that doesn't include antisocial behaviour. So what is the reform bill, David, actually suggesting is going to essentially replace the function of Section 21?
So I think let's talk about Section 21 first, and we'll come on to SB when we talk about Section 8. But I mean, the short answer to Demi's question is, damn, yeah, we'll absolutely restrict this, because the entire objective of the white paper is to get rid of Section 21 altogether. Now, actually, it's much more than that, and this is quite important. What the government is in fact proposing to do is to get rid of assured short-hold tenancies and to get rid of fixed-term tenancies, which is actually a replication of something that's just happened in Scotland. So the government has made a massive jump and effectively adopted an SNP policy, which is kind of surprising. But we're not just getting rid of Section 21. We are removing the concept of the fixed-term tenancy altogether. So you will not be able to grant a tenant a 12-month tenancy or an 18-month tenancy or a 6-month tenancy. You will grant them a tenancy for an indeterminate period. The tenant will be able to leave with 2 months' notice to you. You will not be able to ask the tenant to leave unless you can make out one of the grounds in revised Section 8. So it's actually much more than just getting rid of Section 21. And I think that's one of the things that people haven't fully got their heads around yet. And in fact, as I've already indicated, I don't think that getting rid of Section 21 is that big a deal necessarily, provided you have appropriate grounds for possession in Section 8 to allow you to do the same things that you needed to do under Section 21, but shorn of the abuse element of it. Where I am much more concerned is where you get rid of fixed-term tenancies, because I think that has knock-on effects which are extremely problematic in specific sectors. And the most obvious example, but it's not the only one, is the student sector.
Indeed, and actually Simon, one of our viewers today, asked questions around that in terms of, from a student letting perspective, obviously given they tend to be fixed term and for 12-month contracts, really how can a landlord ensure that they get 12 months worth of rent? How can a landlord commit to the next year when Section 20 doesn't exist? There's clearly some fear around the position student landlords are in context of the change.
Yeah, but I think we should bear in mind this will really disadvantage students as well, because the reality is that students will have to give 2 months' notice. They're not always the most organised of people. If they don't give 2 months' notice, then the landlord can hold them to their notice. So I think many students will find themselves quite... And what's even worse in student landlord property is if you're a purpose-built student property block that's being operated by Unite or one of these big guys, and you're licensed with the Unipol code, you can have a fixed-term tenancy, which you can enforce. But if you're everybody else in the student sector, and let's be clear here, that is the majority of the student sector. Small private landlords house most students in the country, particularly outside the southeast. And the stats show that the big blocks are housing around 20 to 30% in some of the big northern sort of student towns like Leeds and York and Manchester and so on. Then you can't have a fixed term tenancy. So students will probably have come from a hall in their first year, not appreciating that they didn't have to give notice. Will move into a private sector property, not appreciating they do have to give 2 months notice. And landlords now feeling the pressure of these type of situations are much more likely to say, well, I'm sorry, but normally I might have not worried about it. But in the new regime, I am holding you to your notice and I expect you to give me 2 months notice, and you haven't. And you can't leave. Or if you are going to leave, you're going to have to pay me more money. And then as against that, of course, what will happen is students will tend to leave early as soon as their studies are over, which will mean, of course, that landlords potentially face council tax bills for a month or two between students in the void periods, or have void periods, much more. The government hasn't even remotely thought about situations where there's a group of students and one of them wants to leave, because in a periodic tenancy, one student can give notice for all of them. In a fixed term tenancy, that can't happen. So the government hasn't even addressed this problem in their white paper, and obviously doesn't even recognise its existence. So there's that problem as well. And then you also have the obvious example of landlords tend to sign tenancies quite early, often in January time, for students to move in July time. And they'll often sign and execute the tenancy in full because people want commitment on both sides. The students want certainty, the landlord wants certainty. And now they're going to have to say, well, I'm not so sure my current students will move out. So what will they actually do? They will sign a tenancy with these tenants. They will say it's subject to contract. They will not execute it. And then they will wait and see if their current students move out. And you will have an awful lot of students, I think, having their landlord turn to them and say, well, I know you signed the contract with me, but it was subject to contract. It hasn't been executed. It's not binding on me. My current students haven't left. So unfortunately, you can't move in. And you now have to find yourself accommodation, a month before your studies start, when there's basically nothing. So sorry, but it's not my fault. And I think the problem here is the reason this happens is the NUS has a policy position that students shouldn't get a worse deal than other tenants. And I get that. I understand their point. But they're not really playing then for students. They're basically playing for the relatively small number of mature students with families who do tend to make up the leadership of the NUS, unsurprisingly. But the reality is that's not most students, and the NUS is advocating for a relatively small group of students while failing to appreciate the enormous damage they're going to do to the majority.
And we talk about students there, but HMOs, is there any other change that would affect them or not affect them in the same way students seem to be marginalised from a process perspective?
Well, with HMOs, again, I think landlords are going to find themselves moving much more to roomlets, because if you've got an HMO with a group of occupiers and it's a periodic tenancy all the time, one occupier will give notice that will be effective on every. You get yourself in a complex position. I think you're going to find that landlords will move more and more and more towards roomlets, which means, of course, that individuals don't have a choice about who they live with, because they don't come as a settled group. They just get somebody imposed on them. And I think that the government's failing to appreciate, and again, we'll come back to this, the enormous amount of damage that low-level antisocial behaviour by one occupier can do in an HMO as regards the other people in it. And there are other changes that we're not really talking about today, like pets and so on, and things like that. And I just don't really see how forcing landlords to accept pets in HMOs, for example, is ever going to work.
No, I'm still waiting for the list of what a pet is. We had this conversation on another webinar, and one of the arguments was
anytime soon.
That last question actually was from Claire. Sorry, Claire, I forgot to note you. Good morning, Claire. We've got a couple of questions coming in around the fact that with this reform, this essentially removes the fixed term aspect and the reliance on the AST. Will there be a new contract coming into place that agents and landlords will be utilising in light of the change?
Well, assured and assured short hold tenancies are very similar in practice. Undoubtedly there will be some marginal change to agreements. The white paper does hint at, and it says the government will at some stage introduce an obligation to have written tenancies. in the future. Now, I don't know whether that means in the future when they're doing all this existing stuff with Section 21, or in the future at some other time. But it actually seems to me that this is a terrible mistake, and I think the government should simply impose the same requirement you find in Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland, the Channel Islands, and almost every other European country, that landlords should just be required to provide a written agreement. I don't think that harms the vast majority of good landlords. I can't see many letting agents complaining about it. And it would seem to be a positive thing for tenants to have a clear written agreement. And I don't understand why the government just wouldn't do that. It would solve a lot of problems. I mean, obviously there would be teething problems, and clearly in Wales, the new written agreements are causing a lot of problems because they are wordy, if I say he says euphemistically, by which I mean 40 plus pages of words. And you'd have to be careful about that. But I see no particularly good reason why we shouldn't just mandate written agreements in England, actually, and just say, this is broadly what's going to be in it, and then you can tinker with the edges. But yeah, sure, people will have to make some changes to their tenancy agreements, undoubtedly.
And there's a few comments in, one from Mike and others, around the fact that this move away from fixed term results in landlords exiting the market. We covered this in previous webinars, and I think the point to make, I suppose, around landlord exit is landlord exiting and property exiting are two different things, in my view. I don't think every landlord that exits takes their property with them away from the market. Now, my personal opinion on this, David, is that we see more consolidation, and we're getting into the world of crystal ball here. But given the amount of questions we've had on it, what's your view on landlord on this reform essentially driving landlords out the market? I feel like there's a bias towards that, and it frankly for me may be a little lazy in the sense that the properties themselves may well remain in the industry as accommodation.
Tenant groups always go on about this, and they get very excitable when people like me say landlords will leave the market, and they say, well, the property won't be destroyed, so either another landlord will buy it, so fine, or it will be bought by someone who was a tenant, and therefore they will be removed. But I mean, clearly this is garbage. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, because if that were true, we currently have landlords exiting the market, and demand is higher than it has ever been. So if it were true that the properties weren't leaving, or that there was no problem, then demand would be dropping as people bought the houses. So the problem here is not that landlords will or won't leave the market. The problem is simply that there is an insufficient supply of properties for the demand in specific areas of the country. And you can't move properties around. They're not like other commodities. If I have lots of apples in London and lots of people don't want them, but they want them in Newcastle, I ship apples to Newcastle. That's not a problem. You don't ship properties up the road. They are where they are. So the first point is supply and demand is not classical Adam Smith economics in property, because you can't move it around. It is where it is, and people don't. And demand is not fungible. It's fixed in specific locations. Or to use another classic property phrase, location. Other TV programs do exist. There's a problem there. But the other problem is that if landlords sell and a new landlord buys the property, the first thing that a new landlord does is refurbish the property. So it's off the market for several months. So in fact, at least on a pre-basis, you do actually reduce supply. The second point is that a new landlord will have a different economic strategy and will probably run rents up to near the market rate when they put their newly refurbished property back onto the market. So rents tend to rise across the board, which is a problem. The third point is, if you sell to somebody who was a tenant, the reality is that tenants who are buying property probably don't want to buy properties in the area they've rented. In most cases, they in fact don't. Most studies show tenants don't want to buy in the area they currently rent in. They probably don't want to buy the type of property they were renting. They're probably looking for something smaller, and they definitely don't want to buy a property to share with other people. So any tenant who's currently sharing is going to be buying up a property that isn't actually available on the tenant sector, or at least not in their market of the tenant sector, and actually is going to end up increasing the amount of demand because they will have left and there'll be more people looking for shared property. So So I think the problem when people say the property doesn't leave the sector, I agree with that statement. Or the property doesn't disappear. It may leave the sector, it may not, but it becomes unavailable to the sector, and it potentially becomes unavailable to the same segment of the sector for a period of time.
In this, agreed. In the same way, and especially the rental value piece, I think is important to note. That change is naturally going to increase the rents for a number of different reasons. And you talked about these sort of knee-jerk reactions. We've seen somewhat a knee-jerk reaction north of the border only this week in terms of freezing rents, which we've had one or two questions on essentially around that.
The last point I would throw in there that people forget about is that you've got to bear in mind that arguing about whether or not properties should be rented or sold or available for holidays and second homes actually misses the point that we just don't have enough properties.
Yeah.
And so the problem here is not that you're driving landlords out of the sector, it's you're driving investment out of the property sector as a whole. And the difficulty at the moment is we spend far too much time arguing about what type of properties to build, whether they should be socially rented, market rate, or whatever. And there's quite a strong group of people that led, and I agree with these people, led by what they tend to call the YIMBYs, the Yes in My Backyard groups, who basically take the view that we should just build property. It doesn't matter that much what it is. We are so short of property, you shouldn't care. You just need more supply. Full stop.
Mm. And with that in mind, then, to bring this back into the letting agent space, what do you think the effect of this change is going to be on agents themselves? Maybe their day to day, how they act, but also what their outlook looks like in the next sort of 18 to 24 months.
Well, at the moment, agents are very focused on fixed term tenancies and doing renewals because it certifies their fees. Agents need to adopt a more sophisticated understanding of the OFTB Foxton's cases and their understanding about fees. It will put agents in very difficult situations on let-only arrangements because they will find it harder to obtain fees going forward. So I think there'll be a further drive towards rent collect and management situations. Or a further drive away from commission, which I think is increasingly an anachronism in the let sector anyway. It doesn't do what people think what people say it does. It's actually mostly a driver of negative behaviour, in my opinion. I don't doubt for a minute someone will immediately pop up and tell me I'm wrong, and you're free to disagree with me on this. But most of the time I see commission as a driver of negative behaviours. And I think it's also laughable to suggest to a landlord that getting him another 50 quid in rent when for the agent, particularly by the time you've gone through the business and got to the actual individual, they're getting maybe 50p. Is that really any kind of driver to anybody? Of course it's not. It's the driver for most agents is to do deals. They're not actually that. Often the commission percentage is less important than the fact they're getting paid. So I think commission often drives negative behaviours, and then you've got just the general effect of more difficult management situations. I think if evictions are going to be more complicated, then agents are going to have much more effective management, much more effective record keeping, and be much more attuned and have much greater understanding of how the process works and how they're going to fit into it, which is inevitably back to training, education and standards. And the difficulty remains for agents in this area that there are some really great agents out. I'm assuming that there are 495 of them signed into this, because the problem is that there are lots of really bad agents out there who don't care, aren't interested. And the difficulty remains, of course, that the sector has a terrible problem retaining people. And if you don't retain people and you have turnover, you don't get good agents.
And if this is, see, my view on this is if this is difficult for agents, then goodness me, it's difficult for landlords. And if agents, I'd like to think, and I believe actually my interactions with agents would suggest this, that they are well ahead of the pace of landlords in understanding what the changes are. They have a appetite to understand how they can utilise that change and really perform and deliver great customer service into their landlords. So for me, there is a value add here that if you are indeed investing in education and the training and you are ahead of these changes, there is an ability to really educate and justify the fee away from any commission aspect, but actually justify why you're there and justify the support and help you can give, because of the 170 odd or whatever it may be points of legislation that agents and landlords have to follow, there's a professional outfit there that can manage that. But I suppose your point there, David, is that along with all those people that can manage that, there's a whole group that don't manage that very well and therefore devalue the perspective and of letting agents to other landlords, maybe.
Agents are very poor at selling the sizzle, as in explaining what it is they actually provide as value add, because the vast majority of landlords think their agents provide poor service. And the reality is, if you go and look at the ombudsman decisions, agents are very bad at communication. That is the largest single complaint about agents is bad communication. And a lot of agents are guilty of it. And I point out that lawyers also are guilty of the largest single area of complaint about lawyers is bad communication. So don't think I'm being hypocritical about it. I agree it's a problem for my sector as well, and probably for me just as much as anybody else. Agents are not terribly good at explaining to landlords what it is that they provide. Lots of landlords basically think they could do it themselves if they could be asked. And the difficulty is that agents are not great at explaining that additional stuff. And agents have access to so much material that they could use and repurpose and provide to landlords in terms of guidance and guides and, just value add stuff. And they don't do that. And I think that this kind of change may force agents really to start really thinking about that stuff, because you will not be able to pilot high and sell it cheap and just turn stuff over in the same way. In my opinion.
And that's been a long time coming, frankly. The race to the bottom on fees, the devaluing of the agency services is I fear a breaking point in terms of the massive agents, the small amount of landlords available and new property available coming to the market. Something has to change there. And the cream, I think, or I hope, will rise to the top. Before we move on to Section 8, appreciate we spent a bit of time on Section 21. But we have got some breaking news, David. I think in the time that we've been online, Eddie Hughes has resigned. Eddie Hughes being
not a surprise, major Boris supporter.
Major Boris supporter, stuck in there actually longer than most thought he would, actually, given the change in government. But that's, I think, important, because Eddie Hughes was one of the main driving forces, if not the main driving force, behind some of this reform. We were going to talk in the Section 8 piece around the change of government. It feels timely to do that, given the number of questions or notes coming in around Eddie Hughes leaving. What's your initial take on that? So
I expected Eddie Hughes to resign. He was an outspoken supporter of Boris. As the cabinet started to shape up over the last 24 hours or so, it was patently obvious that Liz Truss was putting in her loyalists. And while there are still some Boris guys in there, they are not the majorly loyal Boris people. Eddie Hughes was always likely to find himself returning to the backbenches. There was a good profile in Inside Housing last night, which I put on my LinkedIn, because I thought it was very good this morning, of Simon Clarke, the new head of DLUHC, the new Secretary of State for the department. It is notable that he has mainly been a house building guy. He has an interest at Treasury in cladding. And so the cladding people are probably breathing sighs of relief at the moment. They were probably a bit nervous because there was a rumor Jacob Rees-Mogg was going to head DLUHC, which would have probably led to total destruction of any possibility of government support in terms of cladding reform, and keeping that cost from being passed on to leaseholders. I think that will make them happier. But he has voted against, for example, increasing civil penalties, which is a policy within the Fairer Renting White Paper. I think that parts of the Fairer Renting White Paper will go ahead. I think it's notable, for example, that the DLUHC just started their consultation on bringing the decent home standard into the PRS. I could see them doing that. I can see them carrying on with the portal. But I certainly wouldn't be betting money that we're going to see the end of Section 21 just yet.
What a fantastic way to finish
the entire webinar might be a waste of time, and you should sign up immediately.
What a fantastic way to spend the last 43 minutes then on that basis. But I think that's insightful. The knock-on effect, of course.
The numbers are dropping already.
Yeah, they've gone. They've realised this is a waste of time. They're only here for the content. So the knock-on effect of the end of Section 21 is indeed changed to Section 8. So if we can move on to the next slide, Sarah. One of the biggest sort of focalized issues the lender of Section 1 is this fear that I can no longer get my property back. I want my property back now. I need to have my property back now. I can't do this anymore because Section 21 disappears. Now, that isn't actually true, is it? And there are devices and grounds put in the new reform. Whether it happens or not, given your last statement, this could again be completely pointless. But let's cover hypothetically it does get put into place. If a landlord wants their property back, what can they do under the new reform?
So, yeah, I mean, it's not as simple as saying you can't get your property back, because the government actually, obviously, and hardly a surprise really, has got to put it in place specific mechanisms to get properties back through Section 8. So they're doing two things. They're revising existing grounds of possession, in some cases to make them easier. So, for example, ground 1 and 2, so ground 1 used where I want my property back for myself and my spouse, has traps in it, which, like, for example, you can't use it if you haven't told the tenant before the start of the tenancy you might rely on it. The government is proposing to get rid of those traps and to make some of those grounds smaller. They are proposing a new ground for possession for persistent serious rent arrears, so tenants who drop into serious arrears more than 3 times in a year can be evicted as a mandatory ground for possession. I don't think that adds much. But
just on that, David, actually, because this came up in the last webinar, and I'm not sure we have any further clarity on this, but that 3 times that 3 strikes and you're out ruling, basically, the way I read that was you need to be in arrears by 2 months or more 3 times within that period. Yeah. So let's hypothetically say in January I'm 2 months in arrears, but I pay February. So by February I'm still 2 months in arrears. Does that count as 1? And then March would count as 3. If I start to keep up with the rent, but don't back pay the 2 months previous.
No, it's talking about you clearing down from 2 months and going back up to 2 months.
So you would right, okay. So there isn't
if you're in 2 months arrears in January and you pay February, you're still 2 months in arrears.
Yeah.
So I mean, one of the problems here we should bear in mind is that a number of people don't appreciate how Ground 8 actually works. So I should be very clear. Ground 8, if I serve a Section 8 notice citing Ground 8 just now, and the tenant clears the arrears but drops back into arrears before the court hearing, then Ground 8 is still made out and they should still be evicted, and they will be. So the first point to bear in mind is that people think that if I serve a Section 8 notice citing Ground 8 and the tenant clears some of the arrears, I can't then go to court and get possession. Absolutely I can. And so there's some misunderstanding. What this is really aimed at is tenants who, over a more extended period, keep dropping over 2 months and then dropping back out and dropping in again. But the trouble is, of course, it's a bit nonsense because, as I've already said, if a tenant drops out of 2 months arrears but drops back in before the court hearing, you're going to get possession under Ground 8 anyway. There is also a discretionary ground for possession called Ground 11 for persistent late payments. And the vast majority of judges, if presented with a case where a tenant has been in serious rent arrears 3 times in a year, are likely to evict them anyway. So there's some doubt as to whether a new ground for possession for serious rent arrears is adding much. And actually, the original, prior to the white paper, there were previous discussions. One of the previous proposals was actually to say that if a tenant got into 2 months arrears, then Ground 8 would survive in court unless they were less than 1 month in arrears. So they would have to clear down more. They couldn't just pay off 50 quid and just drop below 2 months. They had to get it below 1 month of arrears. Otherwise, you were still entitled to possession, which I actually thought was a far more effective means of operation and actually dealt with the bigger problem from a landlord's perspective.
And in terms of arrears, there's certain changes to the notice periods, aren't there, from 2 to 4 weeks, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, so they're talking about increasing some of the notice periods up to a month. And I think also they're looking at more standardization, because at the moment you've got no notice for ground 14, 2 weeks notice for ground 8, 10, 11, 12, 1 month's notice for ground 7A and 7B, and then 2 months notice for a load of other grounds. So I think that there's sort of trying to avoid having all these different notice periods and standardizing it down to one simpler notice period. And go on, sir.
Sorry, I was going to say, because I remember the original sort of mandate of the reform, and it was to give landlords accelerated powers where there was clear breach. There was wording to that effect. It might not be verbatim, but it's pretty much that was the wording. I don't see how this. No, I mean, I really struggle to see how this does that, because even on the basis level of going from 2 to 4, I mean, there's no acceleration here at all. So I think just completely missed that point and not really look to deliver that, or because this is dragging things out further in some respects.
I mean, this is the difficulty, though, isn't it? Is that the government wants to do this, but actually the existing grounds aren't that bad. The problem isn't really the grounds, it's the courts. And buggering around with notice periods by a few weeks here and there isn't going to fix the courts. So what? And the other thing the government's put in as a sort of throwaway is say, oh, well, we're going to make it easier to recover possession through antisocial behaviour, but they haven't said how. And the reality is, what they're going to do. There is grounds possession under for antisocial behaviour. You're going to have to go to court and prove it. They're currently discretionary grounds, but if you prove antisocial behaviour in court, judges don't say, oh, you've proven it, but I don't fancy giving you possession, because it's serious. You move it to a mandatory ground, it won't change that much, because you're still going to have antisocial behaviour. And the difficulty, in fact, in terms of proving antisocial behaviour is proving the antisocial behaviour, because you can't get the neighbours to turn up in court. So unless you change the basis of proof, then you don't change much. And the difficulty, of course, is that you can't go too far in changing the basis of proof, because otherwise people could just make accusations, antisocial behaviour left, right and centre to throw tenants out. You've got to have some evidence, and you've got to prove antisocial. Otherwise, it's not fair.
And Mark sort of backs his points up. Good morning, Mark, saying he has a rent arrears claim, 14 months so far. We've yet to have a final hearing, which is clearly a long, long time for a landlord to be sat not receiving rent, and be sat in a property that they're not paying for.
And I've got clients in the same position. The problem is not so much the law there. The problem is that if you go to court and get a first hearing and the judge isn't satisfied at the first hearing you get possession, you'll be waiting till your hair grows out until you get a second hearing. And you can wait. I should imagine of his 14 months, probably about 6 of it, at least, has been spent twiddling his thumbs waiting for a court date.
Yeah.
I've actually got cases at the moment, to give you an example of how ridiculous some things are, where possession orders have been given and I can't instruct the county court bailiff, because the county court bailiff won't currently accept instruction if you don't have the possession order typed up. And the courts are taking so long to type up genuine orders that have been given that you don't get them within the 14-day period when the tenant should have left. So you can't instruct the county court bailiff because you don't have a possession.
In Mark's case, actually, it was a lack of judge, he says, for the last hearing.
And plenty of cases cancelled recently for lack of judicial time. So the problem here is, and this has always been the problem, is that Section 8 is often blamed for being no good. But actually, the blame is not Section 8. The law isn't that bad. The problem is the system that is meant to enforce the law. And the problem frequently is the court system.
And every fibre of my being is now wanting to go on a monologue around why rent protection insurance is important and how we can help. But I hope that mere statement pushes people in the right direction if they're not looking to protect themselves. Because
but you should bear in mind. I mean, this is a good point that's worth throwing in. I mean, the economics of rental protection insurance is set for a major shake-up. If the courts get slower, then rental protection insurers inevitably are going to have to push their premiums up because they're going to have to wait longer and pay more money. If Section 21 goes away, then rental protection insurers it's going to cost them more money to obtain possession. And I should also, to be fair to rental protection insurers, point out that they also drive down the fees that are paid to solicitors. So the quality of legal work potentially is going to have to be improved. And rental protection insurers will have to pay out more to solicitors to get higher quality legal work. So there are challenges. The trouble with these kind of changes is it's not just about landlords and agents.
No,
there are challenges across all elements of quite a complex and developed sector. And the economics of rental protection insurance, I'm quite sure you guys are thinking about it, is going to be radically different.
There's a reason why I'm much grayer and look a lot older than I did only 2 or 3 years ago, David. You're preaching to converts. No, and indeed, when it comes to that side of the market, we've seen 100% increase in premium, frankly, in the last 3 years because of the effect of COVID and the knock-on effects of distress in the courts. Things like this are only going to add more challenge. And
it's incredibly challenging, of course, because if a rental protection insurer puts their premium up, which they might feel they have no choice but to do, more landlords will say, well, I don't want to pay that premium, I'll run the risk. But then the difficulty of too many landlords do that is then you don't have the premiums coming in, so you have to put the premium up higher, and it becomes a circle that leads to collapse of RPI. So you've got it's a very fine balance.
I mean, that balance, I think, is quite a way off, to be fair. And what we're seeing actually in the last few months is a consolidation of landlords' efforts to take rent protection. We're seeing more and more landlords than ever taking a level of service, despite maybe increases in price versus, say, 2 or 3 years ago. So, but I take the point.
You always drive insurance purchase. It's a good situation at the moment from your perspective, and that people will buy insurance when they're in an uncertain climate. But
yeah, and it's balancing those two sides to make sure that there's a comfy place for both parties, I suppose. But away from rent protection insurance, again, this isn't really about good law. I want to sort of finish on the managing antisocial behaviour, because you touched on it briefly there, saying actually there's a suggestion here that there should be a mechanism, but there's very little detail. Can you take us through exactly what's being suggested from an antisocial perspective?
Well, I mean, practically nothing. I mean, this is the trouble, is that what's being suggested is it will be more robust and they will ensure landlords get their properties back. But the difficulty with this, again, is that the government has this very, of late, the Conservative government under Boris Johnson particularly, and going forward, has had a very messed up attitude to the courts. And they think that the executive can order the courts to do stuff, and it just can't. I mean, that's the whole point of a three-legged constitutional system, is that the courts are independent. So there is no ability for the executive to turn around to the judiciary and say, we want you to give possession more in these cases. That's not on the cards. The only way they can do that is by changing the law, which they've got to get Parliament to do. But then you've got to write the law. That's very, very difficult. And you can't just write a piece of legislation that says, oh, well, if a tenant's accused of antisocial behaviour, they must be given, then possession must be given. That's never going to work, because you've then got to bear in mind that you can't throw people out of their homes and disrupt their right to private and family life without good reason. So you've got to contend with all of these different competing problems. I think the real solution to antisocial behaviour, it seems to me, is actually much more to do with how we manage it. Local authorities are supposed to have a role in this. They've mostly, due to cut back on these services. The Homelessness Reduction Act was supposed to require local authorities to set up more schemes to keep tenants in their homes. They've mostly not done it because they don't have the money. So I think the difficulty is that there's a real management problem around antisocial behaviour, and landlords can only manage it so far. So I think, one, there's going to have to be a greater degree of sophistication and expertise brought into the way agents and landlords manage the behaviour. There's going to have to be a greater and more open discussion, a more honest discussion with tenants about what they can expect and what they can't expect. I mean, a certain amount of antisocial behaviour leads to just totally messed up expectations. It's called messed up expectations by tenants. Local authorities are going to have to be more effective in utilising their powers. And then at the same time, the government can tweak the law. But the reality is, I'm not convinced that they can make such radical change as they're hinting at. If you read the Fairer Renting White Paper, it's all hints and no material, because the reality is they know damn well can't do anything.
It will be interesting to see where we land. And of course, there's been a call for evidence that has not long ago closed. So it'll be interesting to see what further detail comes out ahead of any potential legislation, which indeed is potential, especially given your notes around what you think may or may not happen given the new government and personnel change. We are nearly pretty much out of time. I do want to cover a few questions as promised from some of the.
I just ruined the whole question thing by talking too much.
No, that's exactly what you hear. Thank you so much. I've got one in from K. Michael. Can agreements require tenants to provide and pay for rent guarantee insurance? No, I would remind you of the Tenant Fee Act June 2019 that stipulates that wouldn't be the case. If you're a landlord or an agent looking to utilise that service, then please do reach out to us. We can talk to you how to do that in a proper way without breaking any existing legislation. We've got a couple of questions around time frame, and that sounds quite a difficult question to answer in terms of when this would be delivered. Let's hypothetically say the change of government, Eddie Hughes' resignation, because it doesn't make any effect, and this is going down the courses which they wanted to. When would you expect this to come into play if everything was equal, I suppose?
Well, that's a difficult question. I mean, one, the legislation has got to be drafted. Timeframes have already been pushed on that because of the upset in government. You can't see the legislation hitting Parliament now really before spring next year. It'll probably take most of the year to pass through, so it might pass through towards the end of the year. The government is committed to the Fair Renting White Paper to giving not less than 6 months' notice of it coming into effect, which already pushes you well into 2024. Do note at this point there's an election coming up at that point, and that then potentially upsets the timetable further. And then the government has also said that while they might well make this applicable to existing tenancies, they'll give at least a year's notice of that occurring. So one thing I just wanted to quickly throw in that I keep hearing people saying, "Oh, I'll evict all my tenants if the government does this." This would be a bonkers thing to do unless you're planning to sell. Because if you evict all your tenants and get new tenants, then the new tenants will be subject to the new regime. Whereas if you keep your old tenants, you will get more time in the old regime before moving across the new regime. So evicting people because of this, unless you're planning to sell up and leave the sector, is extraordinarily unwise. Don't do it.
Yeah, and I think, if you're viewing this as a business, the mechanisms that are available to you at the moment are, as said, and the new changes do bring in grounds, as we've touched on, for getting your property back in the event that you want to sell. There's complexities behind that, and we need more detail. If one of your family members are looking to move in, etc., somebody's noted in the chat that they have 2 properties, they are going to sell them, and they're going to retain them for their 2 children. If that works, that works. That's great. But ultimately, I don't think there's any need for mass panic to sell up straight away and sit there with change of tenants or an empty properties for the sake of it. But I think you've really covered a lot of the points here really well today, David, especially the points around the supply and demand issues that really are the overarching problems, the court issues that sit behind any change, and getting some of the minutiae detail has been really helpful. Thank you to everybody that's attended. This is a recorded session. A few questions coming in whether this will be shared. We'll share this with all of the registrants. We had over 1,000 letting agents register for the session today. That we shared with all of you. And as always, if we've not covered your question, if we've run out of time, if you've got further questions, please do feel free to reach out to us directly at Good Lord. Any pertinent questions for David we can pass on. But for today, that's it. David, thank you so much for your time. And thank you to everybody who joined us. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with our next instalment in the Renters Reform Bill series. And I think the next one we're joined by Mr. Paul Champlina. So look forward to that. So David, once again, thank you very much. And thanks again to our viewers.
Thank you.
Cheers now. Bye-bye.